Hundreds of alleged gang members deported, student visa holders detained as US President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown faces pushback from the courts. Hello, I'm Arun Naidu and this is The Heat. The Trump administration has launched a full-scale crackdown on immigration in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security has said it will revoke the legal protections for about 532,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans and Venezuelans, setting them up for potential deportation. Many of the policies are being challenged in the courts. CGTN's Jim Spellman has more in this report.
A 30-year-old PhD student grabbed on the street near Boston, Massachusetts by U.S. government agents. Rumeysa Ozturk is from Turkey, studying at Tufts University on a student visa. The government accuses her of being, quote, engaged in activities in support of Hamas and wants to deport her. Her supporters say all she did was speak out in support of the Palestinian people in Gaza. A judge has temporarily halted her deportation and lawyers are fighting for her release.
This is what the face of unfolding authoritarianism looks like in the context of the United States.
Ozturk is one of about a dozen students and faculty known to have been detained, including Mahmoud Khalil, a pro-Palestinian activist at New York's Columbia University from Algeria, who is a permanent U.S. resident, a green card holder.
The United States government has created a policy targeting Palestinian activists, and specifically Mahmoud Khalil, for arrest, detention, and potential removal because the United States government disagrees with his constitutionally protected right to dissent from U.S. foreign policy.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio says more than 300 student and visitor visas have been revoked.
We gave you a visa to come and study and get a degree, not to become a social activist that tears up our university campuses. And if we've given you a visa and then you decide to do that, we're going to take it away.
The White House says more deportations will come, part of a larger crackdown that includes revoking legal status from more than 500,000 migrants, sending troops to the border, seeking to eliminate birthright citizenship, and deporting some alleged criminal migrants without due process, some to their home countries or the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and others to El Salvador's maximum security CCOT prison.
This facility is one of the tools in our toolkit that we will use if you commit crimes against the American people.
For some deportations, Trump is relying on the Alien Enemies Act, an 18th century law last used to detain Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. It allows deportation during a time of war with no due process. Critics note the U.S. is not at war, but Trump argues gang members from Venezuela and other countries qualify.
Well, this is a time of war because Biden allowed millions of people, many of them criminals, many of them at the highest level. They emptied jails out. Other nations emptied their jails into the United States. That's an invasion.
A federal judge has temporarily blocked use of the Alien Enemies Act. The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to overturn that and allow deportations under the act to continue.
The White House knew its immigration policies would face legal challenges, but they feel confident the Supreme Court will side with the administration. The Supreme Court currently leans 6-3 in favor of conservatives like President Trump, who appointed 3 of the justices to the bench in his first term in office. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Imani Cheers is a cultural curator and professor of digital storytelling at George Washington University. Ira Mehlman serves as media director with the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Also with us is immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, and Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Adolfo, let's start right here in the studio. You know, over the past few weeks of the Trump presidency, we've heard a lot about Ukraine, about Gaza, something called Signal Gate as well. But the thing that's really sucked the political oxygen out is the Trump administration's policy on immigration. He used, as we just heard from our reporter, the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members. There has been pushback from the courts. Now President Trump is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to rule on his use of this act. And as we heard from our reporter, it's normally used in times of war. The United States is not at war with Venezuela. So what do you make? Is he stretching the law here?
No, I think we're going to have a far-ranging discussion here, and it's going to be a combination of both law and really politics. But let me start out with the political aspect of this. This is what the president ran on. I think it's very clearly, I would be shocked if any of the other guests here are going to say that they didn't expect this to be the Trump policies. They might disagree about the legality involved, and we can have a debate about that, but promises kept. Promises made and promises kept. This is what the president said he was going to do. Mass deportations, control the border, as outlined by the reporter. Now, in terms of the courts and so forth, you didn't identify the judge. These are cherry-picked lower court district judges that are all Obama and left-wing judges and so forth.
Well, the judge at the center of this deportation case was appointed by George W. Bush.
Yes, it is, by George W. Bush. This was and also a very liberal-leaning judge, even though he was appointed by Republicans. But by and large, there's been a lot of cherry-picking on judges. But you're right. We'll see what the Supreme Court ultimately decides on most of these issues. But the fact of the matter is this. We are talking about a large number of people in our country that are either here illegally or committing crimes. That's the majority of the cases that are involved in it, or people who are abusing their right to be here. That's what Secretary Rubio was referring to. You're going to hear about constitutional rights and so forth. These are people here on visas. They're here as people who are visitors to our country, have been extended an opportunity to be here, and they are not U.S. citizens. So that is, we are exercising the rights of the U.S. government to protect the American people.
All right, let me go to Kate, who is an immigration attorney. Kate, there is a Republican House member, Victoria Spartz, in Indiana, in one of the districts in Indiana. That's a very Republican state. Her district is very Republican as well. In fact, she won that seat by 56%. Well, she held a town hall meeting to discuss these very issues. It was a very boisterous town hall meeting. And during that meeting, she was asked a question that even though, Trump has deported these people to El Salvador or others that he's planning on deporting, are they not entitled to due process? In other words, do they have legal recourse? This is how she answered that. Let's listen.
A lot of these people, what President Trump did it last time when he tried, if you seek asylum, wait in the other country, not getting here in the country. So there is no due process if you come here illegally because you violated the law.
Okay, Kate, that was very difficult to hear, so I'm going to praise you what she said. She said a lot of these people, what President Trump did the last time when he tried, if you seek asylum, you wait in another country, not getting here in this country. So there is no due process if you come here illegally or you violated the law. Is she right?
Well, it's obvious that the Trump administration would like there to be no due process. They would like to be able to just pluck anyone off the streets and ship them off to a prison in a country that is not their own. And that's why they tried using the Alien Enemies Act to send Venezuelans to El Salvador, and they have denied sharing any information or background about why they are accusing these men of being members of the Tren de Aragua gang, which maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We don't have any information, and neither does the federal judge who's overseeing the case. But I can tell you that many of the families of these men, there are several hundred men from Venezuela who have been sent to El Salvador, and many of the families of these men are speaking out, emphatically denying membership in the gangs by these men. And so the usage of the Alien Enemies Act, which is a very old wartime law by the Trump administration, is a clear and blatant effort to circumvent due process. And it's true, in this country, we have rights. Immigrants and citizens alike have the right to see the evidence against them, and if they're charged with a crime or they're charged with deportation, they have a right to put on a defense.
Right, Kate, my understanding, I should say a layman's understanding of the law, is that it deals with specifics, it deals with definitions. Well, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was asked, what criteria did the administration use to identify these deportees as gang members? And this is what Marco Rubio said.
That list was carefully vetted, provided to us by Homeland Security. We have confidence in it. What we negotiated is the reality that they in El Salvador comply with all the international requirements for imprisonment. So we sent them people, it was a combination of people, gang members, people we knew were involved in activities that were not productive to the United States, all of them removable in terms of our laws, all of them. Every single one of them was someone who was removable from the United States, irrespective, and MS-13 members, many of whom are Salvadoran, that we had identified as MS-13 members that they had helped us identify as well.
So, Kate, there we heard Marco Rubio say that they were deportable, they were removable in terms of United States law. He said our laws. But do these laws make provision to deport people who may be here illegally in the country to a third country, like El Salvador, and they've been deported to a very notorious prison in El Salvador?
Well, I think the distinction about deportability or removability is important, because what happens is if someone is charged with deportability, the way that it functions is they go before an immigration judge and there is evidence brought forth against them, and they can put forth a defense, they can question the evidence, they can bring their own evidence. That's how someone gets charged with deportability. So what's happened here is the Trump administration has skipped over that step, and they've said deportability equals deportation. That's not how it functions. And to the question about whether someone can be deported to a third country, that is at play right now within the courts. My guess is that at the end of the day, the federal courts are not going to allow a deportation of Venezuelan nationals to El Salvador.
Ira Mehlman, good to have you with us. Ira, there's been an attempt by the courts to stop the deportation of these Venezuelans. In fact, a judge ruled against the Trump administration. He tried to stop those flights, but by that stage, the administration said the flights were already in the air. Question is, did the White House violate a court order?
No, they did not. As they pointed out, the flights were already in the air. They were outside of U.S. airspace, and they were headed to their destination. And as you know, it's been already pointed out, we're not talking about your average illegal immigrant here. We're talking about people who are members of criminal gangs who have been terrorizing certain parts of this country.
Okay, Ira, can I stop you there, Ira, to just ask you to clarify that? How do we know that they were members of a gang? How do we know that they were responsible for violence? How do we know that they may have violated the law?
Well, look, I mean, we have records about the fact that Tren de Aragua has been committing all sorts of criminal activities across the United States. The same thing with MS-13. As Secretary Rubio said, they were acting on intelligence that both the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security had. So the Enemy to Alien Act was designed specifically for this purpose, and it doesn't mean you necessarily have to be wearing a military uniform or arriving here in a tank. You have to be arriving here with hostile intent. And if you look at the activities since Tren de Aragua and some of these other gangs have arrived here in the United States, it is certainly hostile intent towards the United States. There's also reasonable allegations that Tren de Aragua has connections with the Venezuelan government, a government that is at best hostile to the United States.
Right.
And this is precisely what the act was designed to handle.
Okay, Ira, why were these alleged gang members deported to El Salvador and not to Venezuela?
Well, you know, you would have to ask the administration. I know that there had been some back and forth with the Maduro regime. At first, they refused to take their own people back, which is another issue that needs to be dealt with. There should be an obligation on the part of any country to accept back people who are being deported from the United States.
Right.
You know, their citizens need to be able to be sent home. But in the meantime, they have now been sent to El Salvador, and the courts are going to decide whether that was legal or not.
Okay, Imani, good to have you with us in the studio. Let's look at the politics of what the administration is doing right now. There was a Pew poll that was released just a short while ago, and it says that only a third of United States adults support deportation, but that number changes to 51% if the person being deported is found guilty of committing a violent crime. But here's another poll, a CBS poll, and this is really important. That CBS poll shows that an overwhelming majority of Americans say there must be a judicial process before deportation. So they're saying the rule of law must be paramount. So is President Trump out of step with what the American people want?
Well, I think it's very clear to know that President Trump his administration, they are no strangers to the legal process in this country. And we know for a fact that if there's anyone who has dealt with our courts personally as well as professionally, it is Donald Trump. So what we're seeing right now is the reality that, yes, we have a number, as you mentioned in that poll, those numbers stating how many Americans want to see a due process. But as you know, my fellow panelists said at the top of the show, this is exactly what was promised. This was exactly what was laid out in Project 2025 that I've discussed on this show many a times. I actually did read, not the entire thing, but definitely a good portion of it, where this was laid out. This was very clear. This was something that he not only promised during campaign rallies, but also was very clear that this was going to be top of mind as soon as January 20th came out. So I think personally, there are a lot of course, the legal questions that we're all debating here this evening, and there will be, you know, there's still time to see what's going to happen, whether there be planes that were out of U.S. airspace, and like all of these things. Why go to El Salvador? Why not go back to Nicaragua? Why not go to any other country, any ally in particular? Why not go to Mexico? Like, there's all sorts of questions to be asked. But I think the reality is that, again, promises were made, and this in particular promise is being kept. I think there's a larger conversation when it comes to the deportation of students or individuals on visas who are protesting the war in Gaza and the current genocide. That is completely different. These are not criminals. These are not people who, these are individuals who were participating and using their First Amendment right, and they are being kidnapped off the street by plainclothes ICE officers and being held indefinitely. And I think that's a larger conversation to be had that is separate from the criminals or alleged criminals that are being deported right now to El Salvador.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit more about that in a moment. You know, you are a teacher at a very well-known university, one of the best-known universities. But Adolfo, let me ask you this before we get on to the student thing, and that is, as a lawyer yourself, what we're talking about here, you know, the rule of law, due process, etc., isn't that the bottom line? I mean, you can't deport someone or jail someone or impose any kind of punishment on them just because you think they did something or that's your opinion.
Well, that's correct. But the problem is the following is, this is, and again, forgetting that the Biden administration simply decided not to enforce the law, as the president has said many times, and you have now millions of people in the country here illegally. And now we're supposed to be worried about due process for people here that are either illegal or part of violent crime. So forth. I didn't see the due process for Lake and Riley and people that were murdered in the country. I see this great concern.
But that doesn't make this right, does it?
No, it makes this right in this regard. These are not U.S. citizens. You're not talking about American citizens here. That's just to be very clear about this. So we'll see. You know, my colleague here has said that she thinks the courts will side with these defendants. We'll see when the Supreme Court decides this matter. I think there's broad latitude on immigration policy given to the president and on foreign policy. But I will say one thing that you've sort of skipped over. 58% of the American people support the immigration. That's the CBS poll that you referenced. CBS, 58% support the president's immigration policies. That's the highest of any of the items that were polled that President Trump resigned.
Yeah, but there is that caveat that people can be deported. They support that as long as they go through the courts.
I think the vast majority of the American people, we just had this discussion, have seen these violent criminals at Nicaragua or whatever as people who should be deported and should be deported. This manipulation of our system needs to stop, and that's what President Trump is doing.
I want to get on to something that Imani just mentioned. This is the case of Rumeysa Öztürk, who is the Turkish doctoral student. She was nabbed on the streets. She's now in an immigration prison, we understand, in the state of Louisiana. The government accuses her, although there have been no formal charges, the government accuses her of being in support of the Palestinian group Hamas. She was in the United States legally. How do you justify that?
Well, I don't know the facts of this particular allegations. They haven't been discussed here as to what type of activity the person. That was just an opinion. You know, I think it was even more than that. She was an activist in some rallies.
Being an activist, a deportable offense.
Since when coming to the United States as a visa is a privilege, not a right, and it can be revoked at any time. In fact, even a green card holder who has not have proper vaccination documents, that can be revoked.
Yeah, but does that preclude you from saying anything critical about the government or its policies?
I don't think that's the
this
standard.
is the case.
I don't think that is the standard. But I really do not believe it's saying anything you want. But to being, as Secretary Rubio said, to come to the United States, to be involved in activities that are going on in universities that have become quite, I think, abusive of Jewish students is a concern. I will say one last thing, because my colleagues here sometimes, this ancient law of 1799, where was your concern when President Trump was being accused of doing illegal activities, using Civil War statutes, using RICO? All of a sudden, there's warfare against President Trump was okay, but protection of illegal immigrants is something, it's a different standard.
All right, our time's getting on. I want to get to Kate. Kate, I'm going to talk about the legality of this case. This is a case of Rumeysa Ozturk, the student that we are talking about. There is no evidence that she expressed support for Hamas. And even if she did, is that a violation of U.S. law? I mean, this case, as Imani pointed out, rests on an op-ed that she co-authored with others in which she criticized Israel for its policies in Gaza. I read that piece. The article makes no mention of any kind of support by anybody for Hamas. It is critical, as I said, of Israel. So what is her status? On what basis has she been detained and now faces deportation?
Well, we don't know, and this is, again, you know, like the Venezuelans, or information has not been shared with us. We don't know what charges are against her. Of course, someone on a student visa does, you know, the executive does have a lot of authority over someone who's here. But of course, once someone's inside the United States, they have the right to go before a judge and have a judicial process. And the fact that they just picked her up off the street, these plainclothes officers, I mean, it was really horrific if you've seen the video, and very concerning. So a lot of this, we'll have to see what happens in her case, but it's a lot like the Mahmoud Khalil case, you know, where we're going to have to see what charges they bring against her. And you know, they will be able to put on a defense in immigration court, both of these people.
That's a very fair statement. Okay. Well, because I don't think you know, as the host here, what the charges in the government's case is. Well, I think that's a fair statement. I think it's going to be, you're going to see much more than an op-ed. That's my personal opinion.
Neither of them have been charged yet.
They can be detained, and they're here on a privileged basis. They're not citizens.
Okay, Kate mentioned Mahmoud Khalil. Ira Mehlman, I mean, that case of Mahmoud Khalil, again, he has not yet been charged, if he is going to be charged, with violating any law. He was a permanent resident in this country, a green card holder. I mean, he was held because of his criticism and organizing rallies against the state of Israel and its policies. I mean, have we got to a situation now where it's going to be unacceptable to criticize the policies of a foreign state, in this case Israel, even if that person was here legally?
No, he was not being detained because of free speech here. He organized and he worked with and served as a spokesperson for organizations that were vandalizing university property, that were denying access to parts of the campus to Jewish students. It was more than simply his expression of support for Palestinians. And also, you know, getting back to the student visa, you know, again, that is a privilege, and the State Department does have the right to yank it based on considerations of how it affects U.S. foreign policy. You know, that is the law. Those are the conditions under which people are issued those visas. So in all of these cases, it seems there's more than here than just an expression of free speech here. You had another woman, the doctor at Brown University, who had gone to the funeral of a leading terrorist in Lebanon. All of these things would seem to indicate that they have associations with groups that are antithetical to the United States, at war with the United States, and there's no reason why we should extend visas and the privilege of staying here to people who are not only supporting these organizations, but acting in ways that infringe on the rights of other people on the campuses on which they're protesting.
Imani, this does raise, I mean, it raises more important issues, doesn't it? Because we just heard now that these students are here as guests of the United States.
Sure.
And as such, there is a certain protocol, kind of behavior that they should follow, and that in this case, these students have not followed that behavior. There are also hundreds of students that we've learned over the past week that have received letters calling on them to self-deport because, and this is what they've done, they have, quote unquote, engaged in activism. You know, whatever that is, it hasn't been defined. Now, as I pointed out, you're a teacher at one of the best-known universities in the country. I mean, what impact is this going to have on discourse among students at the country, at the university, and their ability to think critically and, I guess, express their opinions openly?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting listening to this conversation right now, because activism, when it is, dare I say, against the U.S. foreign policy is one thing, but we also saw on January 20th, January 6th, protesters, terrorists being pardoned. And I find it very interesting when you look at and you want to conflate violence. Let's also be very clear. There are a number of Jewish student and led organizations that were involved in last spring's protests. There are still a number of organizations made up predominantly of Jewish Americans who are also in protest.
Yeah, they occupy Trump Tower.
All the time. And so this is something where I find very interesting, because if you say something, yes, understood, they are a guest of this country, absolutely. They are on a student visa, 100%. But they participated in what they're being charged with is, again, when they say Hamas sympathizers, or when they're able to, I would like to say, as someone who was in DC on January 6, 2021, and I saw with my own eyes, not things that were sliced together through news outlets, but I saw with my own eyes, those are terrorists. Yeah. Those are individuals. And the way in which we will conflate to align with a certain political agenda, I think should be terrifying to a lot of people in this country. It's not just whether you are here, quote unquote, on a visa by the guests of a university or the State Department that you can or cannot utilize and access the First Amendment. Because if you can do it when you were born here and you don't like your candidate not winning the presidential election, why can't you when you're standing up for children being murdered in Gaza?
Okay, well, Adolfo, I've got 1 minute. I'm going to talk about one other issue. The president wants to do away with something known as birthright citizenship. In other words, if you're born here, you automatically become an American citizen. That's in the Constitution. Can he do it?
Well, that's going to take a little longer than a minute. It's a little bit reading. No. It's a little bit how you read that about loyal to the jurisdiction of what state, and you can say that somebody's born someplace else originally, that they're loyal to each other than to the United States. So that'll be an interesting. That's an uphill struggle.
I want to give the last 30 seconds to Kate. Kate, on this particular issue of birthright citizenship, is it going to happen? Because some experts say it's doomed.
No, there's no way the Supreme Court is going to uphold it. The federal courts have already weighed in, and they said it's blatantly unconstitutional for the president to try to cancel out the 14th Amendment. He's taken it up to the Supreme Court to say that lower courts can't issue nationwide injunctions. In all likelihood, the Supreme Court is not going to pick it up. We'll find out next week, but I think birthright citizenship is here to stay.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.